Right now, if basketball was still going on, we would be in the middle of the first round of the NBA playoffs. But of course that isn't happening right now, so while basketball is gone, I will be looking back at the NBA during the 2010 decade. It's hard to believe that the 2014 NBA playoffs was just 7 years ago. When we look back at those playoffs, we remember the Spurs revenge tour ending the Big Three era in Miami, the Clippers' famous collapse in Game 5 against OKC in the second round, and of course the infamous Donald Sterling saga that clouded the middle of the first round. It feels like the actual basketball that took place in the first round hardly ever gets talked about because of that black mark on the NBA, but that round was one of the most entertaining playoff rounds ever. The reason I'm going to talk about just the first round of an NBA postseason is because that particular round from that particular year was jam-packed with a number of great matchups that went the full 7 games and had a bunch of great moments. To represent the number of years it's been since that time, I'm going to list 7 things that stick out to me when I remember the 2014 NBA playoff first round. The first thing I immediately remembered was the sheer amount of matchups in that first round that went the full 7 games. The 2003 playoffs was the first year the NBA changed the format of the first round, going from the long-standing best-out-of-5 format to a more definitive best-of-7 games format. Since that year, only one NBA postseason has had a first round with more than 2 Game 7s. And that was 2014. That year, we saw 5 series that had a Game 7. This was partly due to the fact that the Western Conference was so absurd that year, even by its usual standard, that the Dallas Mavericks won 49 games and still finished as an 8th seed. Each of those series had their own individual matchups and narratives within them, producing a great number of games, and to boot, it had a 6-game series that felt every bit as much as a 7-game barn burner. The easy thing to take away from the series between the Portland Trail Blazers and the Houston Rockets would be that series-ending shot from Dame Dolla, but what flew under the radar was, first off, there were 3 games in that series that went into overtime, but more importantly, LaMarcus Aldridge pretty much took the Rockets behind the woodshed. Both teams had identical records, and the Blazers actually had to start the series on the road against the Rockets, but Aldridge made sure that none of that mattered. He dropped back-to-back 40 burgers in both games 1 and 2 to swipe the first 2 wins of the series on the road. From that point on, both teams exchanged victories in back-to-back overtime games in Portland, but ultimately, when the series went back to Portland for Game 6, the Blazers, and more specifically, Dame, made sure the Rockets never left the building.
He wins the series. It's Lillard. He got the shot off. Lillard, good! And the Blazers win the series for the first time in 14 years!
LaMarcus Aldridge was an absolute beast versus the Rockets, averaging monster numbers across the board while giving every big man on the Rockets roster the absolute business. Around this time, the Brooklyn Nets had completed the well-known Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett trade and had now become a Frankenstein roster full of players from yesteryear. Heading into the playoffs, the Nets started out on the road against a Toronto Raptors team that had just wrapped up the best regular season record in the franchise's short history to that point and had made the playoffs for the first time since 2008. The series was a classic case of an old team showing an up-and-coming Eastern Conference power that they still had juice left in the tank. The Nets' experience showed winning Game 1 on the road to start the series, and they were able to stave off a 3-2 series deficit to force a Game 7 back in Toronto that had a semi-controversial ending. Down by 1 point with 6 seconds left, Kyle Lowry had a little bit of daylight to get off a close shot at the rim, but it was Paul Pierce who snuffed out any hope for the Raptors. If you're a Raptors fan, that was a foul. If you're a Nets fan, that was a clean block. If you're an observer, the Nets walked off the court with a 104-103 victory as the Raptors crowd fell silent. Another team's aspirations curb-stomped by Paul Pierce.
I call game!
The San Antonio Spurs started their 2014 championship run with a matchup against an 8th-seeded 49-win Dallas Mavericks team, which had a hodgepodge of players led by a 35-year-old Dirk Nowitzki, a 37-year-old Vince Carter, a 35-year-old Sean Marion, and Monte Ellis. This series was surprisingly entertaining and had 5 games that went down the stretch, including Game 3, which had a game-winning 3-pointer at the buzzer thanks to Vinsanity. Once again, shout out to all the elder statesmen back in that playoff year. The Spurs had a chance to close out the series on the road in Game 6, but Dallas's 37-point fourth quarter helped the Mavs squeeze out a win and force a Game 7 back to San Antonio. But as we all know, the Spurs were on a mission that year, and they closed out the series fairly easily in Game 7. Because the Spurs were so decisively dominant in their next 2 rounds, and then thoroughly whooped the Miami Heat in the NBA Finals, we forget sometimes that the toughest matchup the Spurs faced during that championship run was a longtime foe that's just about 4 hours up the I-35 highway. The Thunder were trying to go back to the NBA Finals for the first time since the dumb James Harden trade back in 2012. Unfortunately, their 2013 playoff campaign was short-circuited when Pat Beverly ran into Russell Westbrook's knee, and in the next round, Kevin Durant had to face off against the grit-and-grind Memphis Grizzlies basically by himself, as the Thunder helplessly lost in 5 painfully low-scoring but close games. Coming into the 2014 playoffs, the Thunder would get another chance to slug it out against the Grizzlies. This time, however, they had a healthy Russell Westbrook, more size, and their yearly tradition of marginally improved shooting from the wing. This series had everything. Crazy plays, crazy shots, and 4 games that went into overtime. The Thunder also faced 2 series deficits at one point, as Memphis managed to grind most of the games in that matchup down to a halt. The Thunder were able to beat the Grizzlies resoundingly on the road in Game 6, but more importantly, as we all remember, a young rookie named Steven Adams baited Zach Randolph into taking a swing at his jaw. The league suspended Zebo for Game 7 as the Thunder brought the series back to OKC to close it out in another decisive victory. This matchup definitely wasn't the most aesthetically pleasing basketball to watch, but it had too many dramatic moments, big-time shots, and clutch defensive plays. The Grizzlies were able to make this series enough of a grind to where we got nothing but rock fights. But god damn it if they weren't dramatic and entertaining rock fights nonetheless. The Warriors were on our screens late into June for the back half of the 2010 decade, but in the first half, they were like every other young team that aimed to make a name for themselves. The Dubs put everyone on notice when they beat a 57-win Nuggets team as a 6th seed in the first round of the 2013 NBA playoffs after a 6-year playoff drought. But on that path to that point, they had some battles with the Lob City Clippers, back when it was actually an even rivalry. From 2011 to 2014, both teams were almost even in their regular season games, and they were pinned against each other in the first round of the 2014 NBA playoffs. The first thing everyone is going to obviously remember from this series is that it was around this time when TMZ leaked the Donald Sterling tape. That's been well documented, and Sterling was swiftly and thankfully removed from the league. But I want to talk about the matchup itself. Both teams exchanged haymakers the entire time, which had close games, a pair of blowouts, and both teams winning on each other's home floor. Game 7 was almost a symbol of what this series was, rather than a climax to an ongoing continual battle. Punches and body blows were exchanged the entire game, and heading into the final minutes, as the Warriors desperately tried to cling on to their season, Blake Griffin made big play after big play down the stretch, as the Clippers eked out a 126-121 win. The Clippers series victory was obviously a sweet one for head coach Doc Rivers, who was seen venting his emotions from dealing with this whole saga. I imagine it wasn't easy dealing with that whirlwind at such an inopportune time, but it was a gutsy win for that team nonetheless. As we all know, however, it would be a long time before the Warriors would lose another Western Conference playoff series again. The 2014 first round for me was pretty easily the most entertaining first round in my time watching the NBA, and I know that sounds oddly specific to make a claim on a defined section from an entire postseason, but it was just so damn good. There were a total of 27 games in that round that ended with a 2-possession score, and we had 8 games that went into overtime. The one-seeded Indiana Pacers were in a dogfight with the Atlanta Hawks for 7 games and still, hilariously, got the NBA TV treatment. A young duo of Bradley Beal and John Wall led the Wizards to their first playoff series win in 5 years over the last gasp of the Tom Thibodeau-era Chicago Bulls. The Charlotte Hornets were still known as the Bobcats, and Josh McRoberts had a pretty good playoff poster dunk. Wait, what? The Western Conference side of the bracket contributed to a good amount of the entertainment factor that went into the 2014 first round, mainly because the Western Conference had 7 50-win teams and an 8th seed that won 49 games. It does kind of bring me back to this current season though, because one of the many things that sucks about the suspension of the NBA season is that we were all pumped about these upcoming playoffs because of the sheer amount of parity that we knew about in the NBA before the season even started. Not only was the Western Conference stacked again this year, but the Eastern Conference finally turned a corner and had 6 teams of their own that were on pace for 50-win seasons. Who knows when the NBA will resume again, but if you're like me and you're wondering just how good these playoffs would have been this year, with the sheer amount of good teams we had, the 2014 NBA first round could have given you a sneak peek at the answer.